The first thing Marcos heard was the voice on the line, thin with breath and panic. He's gone. Hospital. I don't know. An accident. 30 minutes. The phone almost slipped from his hand. A bezel of sweat spread across his temple, while the office around him shrank to the tick of the wall clock. He could see the digits on his laptop, canary yellow against a dark page. 2712. Marcos Henrique Cavalcante had built the company from a seed of stubbornness and a stubborn refusal to accept small outcomes. Today, that stubbornness had become a liability and a possibility at once. Across town, a delegation from Paris was already in the lobby. Crisp coats, serious faces, a patriarch in an overcoat who did not smile without cause. They had flown in for one reason, a meeting that could open Europe to the Sao Paulo firm and deliver, on paper, $500 million reais in investment. He glanced at the glass wall that separated his corner office from the open-plan roar outside, faces moving like fish, phones in hands, eyes sliding between hope and dread. He could imagine the headlines if this collapsed. Contracts dissolved, layoffs whispered down corridors, investors losing appetite. For a company that prided itself on precision, this gap felt obscene. No translator, no bridge at all between a room full of Brazilian executives and French capital that spoke its own etiquette as loudly as its language. Carol, his secretary, was already at his door before the last syllable of the call had left the air. She was a small woman with a competence that made chaos steadier. The sort of presence you could hand a problem to and compress it until it fit in a drawer. She said nothing for a beat, just held up the handset and then the screen of her phone, a dozen tabs open to agencies, translators, emergency services. "He's in the ER," she said finally. "They said the ambulance arrived quickly. He might be out by evening, but not for now." Marcos breathed like someone surfacing. "We can't delay," he said. "Not today." Outside, someone had ordered coffee that no one would drink, and the elevator doors had opened on the French delegation. Jean-Claude Beaumont, in his 70s, the patriarch whose handshake carried the gravity of decades. Felipe, his tight-lipped son, and a lean financial director with an air like a man who had learned how to say no in 5 languages. They moved with the efficient indifference of privilege. Their polished shoes made a sound against the marble lobby that sounded like the start of a metronome. Executives clustered quickly. Eduardo, the CFO, skin-flushed, already scanning for legal scaffolding. Fernanda from marketing, with a hard elegance and a PowerPoint humming on her laptop. Others with frowns that were almost professional. Someone suggested a Google Translate workaround. Another suggested a junior staffer who had once studied French in college.
Both suggestions were dismissed, politely, and then with the quick cruelty of people who knew the stakes. Marcos sat with his hand on the phone now, the weight of a timer and half a company in his palm. "If this goes wrong," he told Carol, quietly, "half the company goes with it." He did not know he had said it aloud until the words echoed in the room as if they had always been there. Panic has a voice. It asks questions it cannot answer. It rewrites reputations in the space of a fistful of minutes. That was the mood in the corridor, a low hum of possibility turned to a sting of urgency. People began to move in patterns that underlined fear, lips pressed thin, shoulders angled toward the exit that would lead to the conference suite. The call had come in exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled time. The hospital, Carol said, had been efficient, but the translator, Marcel, had been the company's cultural instrument, not just a linguist, but a mediator who knew the investors' jokes, who understood the weight of eye contact in a negotiation between Sao Paulo and Paris. The absence was not merely vocabulary, it was a missing key to how this game was played. They checked every contact. They called freelance agencies, clinical linguists, the university programs in the city. Each lead landed with the mundane disappointment of someone who has, at the last hour, discovered that something essential has been misplaced. Eduardo ran numbers in his head and then said them aloud. We present, we miscommunicate, we get cornered into a clause. Tax structuring, liability, the reputational damage alone. Stop, Marcos said. He felt the edge in his voice, the brittleness of someone whose chest had been hollowed out, and then asked to be brave. Find another way. Staff moved like actors in a scene they hadn't rehearsed. Security frowned. The French delegation sat, checked their watches, and took out their phones as if to confirm that their time was as valuable as the schedules printed on their leather folios. At the end of the corridor, a cleaning cart squeaked. Ana Silva was pushing it, a woman in her early 40s whose uniform had the comfortable, unremarkable neatness of something that had been ironed 1,000 times. Her hair was pulled back, her face quiet,
the sort of face that does not call attention but registers everything. She had worked in the building for years, silent, efficient, polite, a fixture nobody learned the details of. She did not belong to their world of forecasts and shareholder slides. She heard the panic like a vibration through the floorboards. She heard the words, investors, translator, hospital, and something in her tightened. She had come that morning with the same small, private rituals. Put the radio on low in the break room, fold the rags just so. She had come with a son to support, bills that had the blunt logic of a ledger, and a past that made the present complicated.
Anna paused in the doorway, one hand on the cart, as the people around her moved like bees to a hive in chaos. She saw the man who had been her boss for months, Marcos, his jaw set, his eyes raw with an urgency that made her feel small as a pebble in a river. She could have kept going. She could have stepped aside and let the company unravel. Instead, she did something quieter and more dangerous. She stepped into the rhythm of the room. "Who is our translator?" someone snapped. No one turned to Anna. They moved around her like a current avoiding a rock. She stood there for a heartbeat, and then, in a voice that was even and flat enough to be mistaken for mere announcement, she said in Portuguese, "I speak French." There was a silence that was not polite. It was the clean kind of silence that shakes a room, the kind that weighs possibility and dismisses it as a curiosity. Carol, for a breath, blinked as if she had misheard. Eduardo's eyes narrowed. The French delegation looked up, amused and inquisitive. "Excuse me?" Fernanda asked, archly, leaning into the strategy of disbelief. "I speak French," Anna repeated. Her French was measured, paired of accent but not without melody. She was not a novelty act. She spoke as if she had always had that language insinuated in her bones. They stared at her, at the janitor's uniform, at the cart. Protocol is a stubborn thing in a corporate environment. It was almost mechanically offensive to imagine that the woman with the duster could be another kind of professional presence. It took a brief collapse of manners for the possibility to be registered. Marcos found himself walking toward her before the questions arrived. He did not ask where she had learned it. He did not ask why she had not said so earlier. The timeline did not permit that depth. "Can you wait outside the meeting room?" he asked. He did not have the right to ask her to save them, but he did anyway. "Could you come in and help?" Anna nodded. Her hands were steady on the cart. She moved without hurry. Composure was part of her profession. In the hall, she folded her shoulders into something like resolve. No one else knew that for 12 years she had worked in France, that she had held a title, operations director, at a mid-sized multinational. No one knew that after her ex-husband's arrest, her name had been dragged into a scandal that cost her work, reputation, and the kind of professional buoyancy that keeps you afloat in a world of meetings and forecasts. She had come back to Sao Paulo, to cleaning in this same building, because the ledger had required it. Marcos did not ask these things because there was no time. He did something more provincial, practical. He asked Carol to bring her an extra jacket and a clean blouse. A small costume change, he told himself. A signal more than a disguise. There was no time for more than a single phone call to the assistant who kept the executive closet. Anna went into the restroom.
The fluorescent light threw shadows across the tiles. She sat, briefly, on the closed toilet lid and breathed. She closed her eyes and let memory come, not as a flood, but a taut, contained thing. A professional life in which meetings had been conducted in French, where a slide deck had been a tool, not an artifact, where she, once, had been in the middle of the room, voice steady, shoes formal, decisions on a desk. She looked at her reflection. In the mirror, the woman who had been the building cleaner and the woman who had been a director overlapped like double exposure. She repeated a phrase in French under her breath, not a line, but the cadence of introductions. "Monsieur Beaumont, c'est un honneur. Monsieur Beaumont, it's an honor." She tested it, softened it, until it landed like a practiced greeting. In the hallway, she swapped the uniform for the blouse and blazer with a practical haste. Carol smoothed her hair, offered a reassuring pat to the shoulder that had learned to carry the weight of grocery bags and complicated schedules. There was a crispness to the transformation that had the effect of reassigning roles. It was not that clothes made her credible, but in a room that worshipped appearances, appearances cleared the first hurdle. They walked into the meeting room and the air seemed to condense. The table was long, lacquer polished, reflecting the ceiling lights like a river. Nameplates sat like little islands. The investors sat with their hands folded, an economy of composure that had been paid for by years of practice. Anna took a seat near Marcos. She could have stood at the edge and translated like a live caption, but she already knew translation was never literal. It was a negotiation of tone, of what was left unsaid. To be a bridge, she had to do more than convert words. She had to read the room and then translate the meanings and the cultural signposts that made sense in Paris and Sao Paulo. Marcos began as rehearsed. The slides, the figures, the market expansion plan. His voice was not perfect, there was adrenaline in it, and that made the numbers sound raw. She listened while translating in her head, filtering, shaping. When he hit a data point that in Portuguese would land as an aggressive promise, she softened it, not by changing the truth, but by reframing the intent, the long view. Mesdames et messieurs, she said in French, smooth and unobtrusive. What Marcos is saying, please imagine this not as a leap, but as a steady step. It's an invitation to build together, not a unilateral claim of success. The slight shift, an adjustment of emphasis, unclenched a seriousness in the investors' faces. Jean-Claude's posture relaxed a fraction. The financial director's lips, thin and critical, loosened just enough to register interest. She translated social doms as much as words. She introduced Marcos with a sentence that emphasized partnership and prudence, terms that the French delegation respected.
She turned big claims into shared possibilities. She punctuated Marcos's phrases with the right French nods and brief clarifications that read as cultural fluency rather than literal gloss. It worked like a small miracle, not because she was magic, but because she knew the music of both rooms and could play them in counterpoint. The first rounds of small talk were merciful. Anna navigated them like a seasoned host. She carried the right anecdotes, not a flood, but the precise morsel that signaled understanding. She told, in brief, an aside about the consistency of the Sao Paulo team's operations, nothing boastful, simply reliable. She translated the subtle Brazilian humor in a way that didn't flatten it for the French ears. By the time Marcos moved into the financials, there was a different tone in the room. The delegation was attentive. Felipe, usually cautious, asked a question about projections, steady, not skeptical, and Anna answered, not only translating but reframing numbers into a timeline that felt sensible and incremental. "You speak very well," the lean financial director said in French to Anna, half a compliment, half a test. She smiled in a way that acknowledged both. "I spent a long time working with numbers in Lyon and Paris," she said. She did not volunteer details about the past. The meeting was a stage, and there would be time, perhaps, for other rooms. That first phase of the meeting was for a few minutes a rescue. The delegation's eyes drifted from skepticism to curiosity. The room relaxed into a different kind of tension, the one that is not immediate panic but cautious interest. The slides landed. The investors began to think out loud, not with dismissive tests, but with the possibility of a future. Jean-Claude shifted forward and asked a question about governance. How would the collaboration be structured, and who would be the eventual point person in Brazil? For an hour that felt like a pause in a storm, the company could breathe. The immediate catastrophe, the absence of a translator, had been patched, and patched by someone they had not expected. A soft relief threaded the office like a note. Eduardo exchanged a look with Fernanda that said without words, this could work. Marcos allowed himself for a sliver of time to imagine the outcome as salvage, not loss. It was at that moment, right after the investors expressed a tentative approval of the market approach, that a subtle shift happened. Anna was translating a clause, an oblique phrase about the proposed investment structure, and the piece of language that had landed for her, as someone who once negotiated cross-border deals, carried an alarm. She stopped the sentence in the translation. The room, used to a smooth stream of words, noticed the break. The financial director's brow creased. Jean-Claude's hand rested on the table like a captain feeling the deck. "What is it?" Marcos asked, mindful of time but already sensing the change. Anna chose her words carefully.
She was no longer merely converting. She had to alert them to a structural fragility they had not anticipated. "In French," she said, in a low voice, "they are proposing a structure that routes significant fees through a subsidiary outside Brazil. On paper, it reduces immediate tax exposure, but the mechanism could, under scrutiny, trigger audits and heavy penalties here. It's not just tax optimization. It could be interpreted as misclassification. If the authorities examine transactions, the company could be exposed to audits and fines that would be large." She did not quantify the fines. That would have been reckless. She spoke in terms the CFO could parse: audits, exposure, reputational risk. She spoke with the authority of someone who had sat across negotiating tables where the word structure meant legal and regulatory thresholds. The room tightened. Eduardo's face, which until then had been the color of focused calculation, briefly shifted to alarm. The French delegation's composure faltered. They were not used to hearing potential liabilities presented so plainly by the other side. It was a pause that held consequences. The financial director asked, in French, sharp and professional, why was this not discussed earlier? Who proposed this routing? Anna translated the question, and then she did something else. She offered an alternative in the language of common sense and collaboration. If we keep the fees in the local entity and agree instead to a performance-based earnout for the subsidiary, she said in French, we reduce the appearance of avoidance and tie rewards to measurable results. That way, taxes are transparent, and the investors still get upside through the earnout mechanism. She wasn't inventing a miracle fix. She was adjusting the architecture of the deal to reduce regulatory signals and align incentives. It was sensible, plausible, actionable. It required time, renegotiation of terms, a restructuring of milestones, but it did not sabotage the investors' interests. Something shifted in the room. Jean-Claude's eyes, which had been cool, narrowed into consideration. Felipe folded his hands and made a small movement that could have been acceptance. The financial director chewed his lip and then nodded as if recognizing the logic. But the reaction was not uniformly positive. The investor asked for a short pause to confer privately, and the room's temperature dropped. This was the moment where deals either collapsed or rewrote themselves. The translation, Anna's intervention, had averted an immediate trap, but it had also introduced a new negotiation vector. They were no longer simply discussing expansion. They were now discussing the mechanics by which expansion would take place. The stakes had sharpened. Marcos asked Anna to stay. Her presence had become both a leverage point and a vulnerability.
She sat without fanning motion or display, her hands folded on the table, her gaze on the investors, an image of someone who had been given responsibility and had accepted it. After the investors' private consultation, Jean-Claude returned and said, in measured French, that they appreciated the caution and were open to exploring the earnout idea, provided that governance assured their protections. He looked at Anna in a way that, for the first time since he had walked into the building, was plainly respectful. There was a movement in the room like the loosening of a knot. It felt like a small victory, tentative, fragile, real. Staff who had minutes earlier been bracing for the worst now exchanged looks of surprised relief. Someone laughed, too high-pitched and relieved. Marcos felt a little of the old rush, the one that had kept him up most nights when the company had been smaller and crises were the currency of growth. It was in that thin instant of respite, when the atmosphere had shifted from frantic dread to cautious optimism, that a soft voice in the back of the room, an editorial voice, produced by the weight of the story, would have said, "For now, we are saved. The worst has not happened." If you love comeback stories like this, like and subscribe. The line landed like a pebble. It was not part of the meeting. It was an invitation to the audience. Witness this. Stay with it. But within the story, the relief had a cost. Relief is not the same as resolution. The investors, now slightly more open, began to ask questions that were deeper, not the surface level of presentations, but questions that exposed the seams of operational reality. How would governance be structured for joint ventures? What would be the oversight over local subsidiaries? Who would sit on the board? These were not the sort of questions that a translator could merely carry. They required institutional knowledge. Anna answered with steady clarity. She translated the technical parts, but she also provided the cultural calibration. In Brazil, she said in French, boards require clarity and local representation. International partners respect oversight, but they also respect speed. We can design a governance model that provides both, a smaller, responsive steering committee that reports to a supervisory board. Her suggestions were not artless. They were pragmatic and plausible. She invoked mechanisms she had used in the past, performance milestones, quarterly reviews, escalation clauses that would trigger mediation rather than litigation in case of disputes. It was a language the investors understood. It eased their concerns because it suggested structure rather than risk. They paused again. Jean-Claude exchanged a glance with his son. "Who is this woman?" the financial director asked, half to himself, half to the room. It was not an insult so much a surprise that competence could appear in a place where expectation had not anticipated it.
Marcos felt something in his chest that was simultaneously pride and something raw, an admission of his own oversight. He had been so busy building that he had overlooked the talent sitting in his building each day. He had not imagined that the person who cleaned his corridors might one day correct his own plan. The meeting adjourned for coffee while the teams prepared a redraft of the clause. Anna gathered the materials around her with an economy of motion that belied the long years she'd spent making rooms ready for others. People approached her now with a cautious newness. Eduardo, still in the hues of concern, leaned in. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked quietly. It was a practical question, but in the tone was a curiosity bordering on apology. Anna gave a small, measured answer. "I worked in France," she said. "Operations. I managed cross-border teams." He nodded, the way someone accepts a data point and files it for later. He did not ask about the scandal. Neither did Marcos. Not now. The clock had not yet run out. They reconvened in the conference room. The energy had shifted from the initial dash of panic to the methodical focus of people who understood the consequences of careful language. The redraft was distributed. Anna read it, her eyes moving with the speed of someone who had read thousands of contracts in another life. She paused at an article that, to the untrained eye, was only legalese. To her, it was a lever. "It's the transfer agreement," she said. "There's a clause framing the subsidiary services as independent contractors rather than employees. That could, under Brazilian scrutiny, create exposure for labor liabilities, not just tax." The French financial director made a sound that could have been concern or curiosity. "How serious?" "Serious enough that an audit could go beyond accounting into classification," Anna replied, translating while keeping the content in the language that calmed investors. "If employees are considered improperly classified, there could be claims for back pay and fines. You could also invite regulatory attention to the structuring. It would be wiser to define clear operational distinctions and to use contracting terms that do not blur the lines." Marcos felt his throat tighten. Everything in corporate life is, at its core, a contest between what the spreadsheet promises and what the law enforces. He had been blind to this from the vantage point of urgency. Anna's observation did not diminish the deal's promise. It only reframed the route by which that promise could be realized safely. The delegation asked for a brief private conference. The executives filed out into the smaller room adjacent to the suite, leaving Anna and Marcos alone for a beat. She sat, quietly, folding her hands as if she had always been expected to be there. Marcos watched her. In the wash of recent adrenaline, appreciation rose in him like a tide.
"Thank you," he said, not entirely sure how formal an acknowledgement should be. She smiled, small and practical. "We can make this work," she said, "but we have to be honest. If we write clauses that look like avoidance, they'll inspect more closely. If we prove we are building value, we make it defensible." He nodded. There was no flourish, no theatrical pronouncement. This was the sound of a plan forming out of a crisis. The door to the side room opened. Jean-Claude emerged first, his presence like a slow drumbeat. He approached the table and placed both hands on it as if to steady himself. He looked at Anna with the flat attention of an elder assessing a new ally or a new problem. "Monsieur Beaumont," Anna said in French, "we believe in building a structure that protects both parties. We propose to alter the compensation model into a phased earnout and to ensure that local operating services remain under the Brazilian entity. This will protect you and grant us the credibility to scale." Jean-Claude considered her words, and then, in French, acknowledged them with a slight inclination of his head. It was an approval that had the weight of real currency. They moved into negotiations that were no longer mere translation. Anna began to tip the conversation toward what she knew from the ground, how local teams behaved, how the regulatory environment treated certain patterns. She pointed out, in ways small but exact, how to create a governance layer that satisfied European investor caution while allowing Brazilian teams room to execute. Around them, the office hummed with the aftershock of a crisis averted but not solved. The clock on the wall still kept its cadence. The investors were engaged. The team was relieved. Yet there was a line of consequences stretching ahead: contractual redrafts, legal reviews, a longer due diligence than they'd initially planned. Anna's interventions had bought time and credibility, but they also had added depth to the negotiation that would require work. As conversations deepened, Marcos found that his pride, once a shield and sometimes a blinder, had softened. Recognizing ability in someone who had been invisible in his company forced an admission that reverberated quietly. He had not known where to look for talent. That realization hurt, and it freed him at once. The investors requested a short break to consider the earnout and governance proposals. In the kitchen outside the conference suite, whispers moved like a current. The company staff exhaled. Phones were checked. People who had minutes earlier been bracing for layoffs now allowed themselves small, careful smiles. Anna walked out to the corridor and leant the back of her hand against the cool marble. For a moment, the room felt to her like a borrowed stage. She had done more than translate. She had translated responsibility, and with it, the chance to alter lives.
Someone in accounting approached her, an earnest woman who had a son Anna's son might have gone to school with, and asked if she wanted a coffee. No, Anna said. Thank you. She was tired in a way that was not simply physical. There were aches that had the cumulative weight of years. There were the ghosts of a life that had once been public and then withdrawn. She had not planned this. She had not wanted the scene. But she had stepped into it because the truth of the world was that sometimes the work demands that you risk the dignity of your silence. Back in the conference room, the investors conferred. Papers shuffled, pens clicked. The pause was long enough for them to imagine 1,000 contingencies. The company had bought them time. Now they had to decide if Anna's suggested path was enough to justify increasing the partnership from a tentative conversation to a formal commitment. Marcos watched them. He knew, with the acute clarity that comes from having built and nearly lost a thing, that any decision now would ripple. Jobs would be created or cut. Lives would be rearranged. His role was no longer to pitch, but to steward. He had been rescued by someone he had never considered, a quiet, capable woman who had crossed social lines with a dignity that made his own measured bravado seem small. The discovery of her past had not been part of his plan, but the present required him to act with a humility he hadn't practiced before. The French delegation called the meeting back to order. The head of their group, after conferring with his son and advisors, addressed the room in French, and then in Portuguese, through Anna's careful translation. They were prepared to proceed, but with conditions: staged payments, governance oversight, clearer operational boundaries. It was not refusal, but it was not full commitment either. It was a negotiation, reborn. Anna listened, translating the nuance, reframing assurance into a language that Marcos's team could act upon. She didn't seek applause. She had come to do a job. Yet as the room moved from panic to the business-like hum of negotiation, those present felt something shift. The company's potential had not evaporated. It had been reoriented. The meeting moved into drafting changes. Legal teams were called into the suite. Marcos watched the way people worked when the crisis had morphed into a sustained effort. There was exhaustion, yes, but also a kind of focused energy that delighted him. It felt like the company at its best: messy, urgent, stubbornly practical. At the door, Jean-Claude paused, and then in French said a single sentence directed to Anna that was both acknowledgement and invitation. "You have a sharp mind." She translated that piece herself, and let the room hear it in Portuguese. Jean-Claude's voice carried no condescension. It carried the respect of a man who had spent a life assessing risk. Marcos felt something else settle in him then: gratitude, and the tremor of the beginning of change.
He knew that whatever happened next, redrafts, legal consultations, signed pages, would be a long haul. Anna had not pulled a miracle out of a hat. She had done what skill does. She identified risk, reframed the language, and offered solutions. That clarity bought the company a new kind of path forward. The next phase, they all understood, was negotiation in earnest. The room prepared itself for the slow work of contracts and conditions. Anna stayed at Marco's side, not because she sought elevation, but because someone needed to keep translating meaning as the legal language attempted to erase it. She had become essential because the negotiation was not merely about numbers, it was about how language constructs trust. The conference room doors closed and the small private huddle began. The stakes were still high. The clock on the wall continued to mark time as though indifferent to the human dramas beneath it. There was more to be done, complexities to unravel, decisions to be made. Outside, in the corridor, a cleaning cart sat empty, its rags folded with the neatness of care. Inside, in the room with the long table, a company that had teetered in panic was now standing, unevenly but resolutely, on the first steps of a new negotiation. The relief had been real and immediate, but it had not yet solved all problems. It had created a new angle from which they would have to fight, think, and commit. Anna folded her hands and prepared for the next round. She did not know how this would end. Neither did anyone else. But for the first time that morning, someone in the company who had been invisible had been seen, and that visibility would change the terms of what they were willing to do for one another. The private huddle lasted longer than anyone had expected.
Papers slid across the table like small, deliberate offerings. Pens tapped decisions into being. The investor's advisor spoke in clipped, clinical French, and the company's legal counsel answered with the careful English of someone translating risk into contingency. Every suggestion carved a new line in the contract drafts until the original shape looked more like a scaffolding for something tougher and truer. Anna sat near the open door, listening. Her hands were quiet in her lap. In the glare of the meeting room lights, she felt the old familiar hum of focus that had lived in her when she was an operations director in France. The same hum that had once made the logistics of a cross-border rollout seem like a puzzle to be unfolded rather than a hazard to fear. For a brief moment she allowed herself the small, steadying thought that this at least felt like a language she hadn't entirely lost. Then Eduardo looked up from a legal clause and gave the kind of look that asks permission without words. Marcos nodded at him. "Anna," he said, could you come in? We need your read on the earn-out milestones. They want metrics."
She rose and walked into the smaller room, the click of her shoes a quiet punctuation. The investors watched her with a new attentiveness, not the curious amusement that had greeted her first words, but the guarded respect of people confronting someone who spoke institutional truth. Jean-Claude leveled his attention and regarded her like one man assessing another who knows how to hold a ledger. She read the draft. Her eyes moved over terms with a speed that turned deliberation into action. "This earn-out schedule," she said in French, and then in Portuguese for clarity, "is weighted too heavily on top-line revenue. It should include operational KPIs, retention rates, delivery accuracy, local margin thresholds, so the earn-out rewards sustainable execution, not just a spike of a pilot." The financial director frowned, and then after a beat nodded. "We can agree to a 3-part earn-out: revenue targets, retention, and operational milestones. But our protection is governance. We need oversight." "Supervisory oversight, yes," Anna said, "but make it light touch. A quarterly dashboard with independent auditors and a steering committee that can fast-track operational decisions. Too much micromanagement kills velocity." Her proposals landed not as demands, but as the language of someone who had sat on both sides of that table, someone who could read what investors needed to feel safe and what operators needed to move fast. She sketched, verbally, a simple governance framework, a steering committee with 2 investor reps and 3 local directors, an independent auditor for KPI verification, predefined escalation paths that moved from mediation to arbitration rather than litigation. It was practical, familiar, and, more importantly, doable. Jean-Claude asked a question about oversight on human resources, how the company would treat local teams in the event of disputes. Anna answered with a candor that read as principle rather than PR. "We tie local career paths to performance milestones," she said. "We create transparent criteria for promotions and a training pipeline that is part of the earn-out budget. That way the community sees real investment." There was a moment, small, human, where Jean-Claude's expression softened. "You speak of community," he said in French. "You know the field." "I do," she answered. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The fact of her words carried its history like a shadow. Those present could sense a life that had been lived in proximity to both boardrooms and kitchens. Negotiations crested and ebbed. There were points of friction: the investor's desire for clarity and swift returns, the company's need for operational freedom, Marcos's wish to protect his employees. Each point required trade-offs. When the conversation drifted to compliance, Eduardo and the legal team argued for conservative language. Anna tempered them, not by weakening protection, but by insisting on pathways for agility.
"We can structure clauses that require transparency," she said, "and still allow us to act. Put the guardrails in, audits, reporting, but give the operators a lane." When the moment came to talk about money, it was Felipe, the son who had sat that morning with measured stillness, who proposed phrasing that, by degrees, opened the door. "We can begin with the $500 million commitment," he said in French, "spread across phases tied to milestones. If you hit A, B, C, we allocate an additional $300 million for a European rollout and joint R&D. We protect ourselves, and we come with ambition." It was a careful offer, one that preserved investor caution while allowing for expansion driven by performance. Marcos felt his heart tick once like a metronome. He could see the map in his head of what those additional funds would mean: new teams, regional offices, the kind of scale that would require months of planning and years of execution. It was perilous and magnificent at once. Anna's response was measured. She translated and then, with the tact of someone negotiating trust rather than cards, proposed the earn-out triggers and governance terms that would justify the extra $300 million. "Include a pilot across 3 cities in the first 18 months, she suggested. use a portion of the funds to build a local training hub. If the pilots meet KPIs, retention, margin, customer satisfaction, we release the next tranche. Jean-Claude listened. He turned the idea over like an object picked up to test its weight. If the pilot is successful, he said slowly, we open both the $300 million and explore other projects across Europe. It took another hour of refinement, more clauses, confirmations from legal, a mutual pause to let the implications sink in. When the investors came back to the main room, they read a shorter, clearer document. They were older men and staffers who had been trained in patience. They were also, unmistakably, people who recognized a strategy that protected downside and preserved upside. They signed letters of intent that evening, conditional and staged, but real. The first commitment was the $500 million, staged across quartered releases tied to the earnout. The second was the conditional $300 million contingent on the pilot milestones and governance. When the head of the delegation, in French, said aloud for the first time what had been taking shape in their faces, "We are willing to proceed," the room exhaled. The moment had the rare clarity of a crisis turned into an opportunity. It was not a fairy tale. It was a set of agreements that would require months of work and a new level of diligence. But it was also a victory born of skill. Anna had not performed magic. She had applied experience where it mattered, and the outcome rewrote a path forward. After handshakes, the room shifted into a different kind of intimacy. The crowd thinned, only the essential players remained. Jean-Claude lingered, asked to speak with Marcos alone, and after a brief conversation, he invited Anna to join them. They sat in Marcos's office, where the afternoon light tilted off the glass. Jean-Claude's voice was less formal now. It carried interest. "You were decisive," he said in French. The translation fell into Portuguese through Hannah. "You have a model and the experience to put it into practice. We do not often find that in this context." Marcos watched Anna. He felt a swell of gratitude that bordered on reverence. He could not, any longer, contain the personal ramifications of the morning. He had been saved by someone he had overlooked. He had been shown his own blind spot by a person who had chosen, in the face of indignity and private pain, to act. He looked at Anna, and with a sudden candidness that startled even himself, asked the question that had been forming like a stone in his throat. "Tell me, why haven't you been in these rooms before? How did you end up here?" Anna's face softened. The answer she had been holding, careful, contained, not anecdotal but essential, unfurled quietly. She spoke not to explain, but to anchor the truth that had carried her. "I worked for years in France," she said. "Operations. I ran projects and people. I had a role that trusted me. Then my husband." She paused, and the way she said the word made it clear there had been a rupture. "He was arrested for financial crimes. My name was wrapped into the story, even though I was not involved. The press was merciless for months. I was investigated, cleared, but the damage remained. Contracts dried up, contacts closed doors that had been open. I came back to Sao Paulo because I had to. My son needed me." She mentioned Gabrielle then, and Marcos heard the way the name carried both tenderness and the resentment of lost time. "There were no grand exits," she continued. "There was a quiet lean into survival, cleaning jobs, small wages, but I never let go of the work. I kept learning, reading contracts at night, following industry news. I refused to let my life be defined by the worst chapter." Her voice did not tremble. It held the same steady cadence she used in negotiations, the same calm that had steadied Marcos that morning. It was not a plea. It was a short memoir of endurance. Marcos felt the weight of the admission in his chest like a tide. He had imagined 1,000 explanations, most of them excuses for his own oversight. He had not imagined the precise cruelty of reputation's slow erosion. "I'm sorry," he said, finally, and the words came with an honesty that was simple and real. "I'm sorry we didn't look. I'm sorry we didn't know." "It wasn't your fault," Anna said. "The world has rooms that only open for some people. You built a company that did what companies do. I'm not here to cast blame. I'm here because I can help make this work." There was a silence that was not empty, but full of meaning.
Marcos had known, vaguely, that talent lived in unexpected places. He had not known the personal costs when that talent was invisible. He felt both humbled and responsible. Jean-Claude, who had been listening, cleared his throat. "We would like to keep you involved," he said in French. "Not only to advise, but to carry operational responsibility in the pilot. We value someone who knows both markets." Marcos translated the offer with a mix of gratitude and an urge that had been born the moment Anna had stepped forward that morning. He could feel the shape of a new possibility forming, a personal redemption that could be matched by structural change in his company. At the end of the afternoon, alone with Anna in the corridor, he spoke in a tone that skipped the ritual of corporate formalities.
I want to offer you more than we can, than I have the habit of offering, he said. I want you to be a partner, 25%, real equity. But there are strings, responsibility, board role, and we need to do something to repair the imbalance here. Anna looked at him. The offer carried weight. A 25% stake was not a token. It implied voice, power, and a seat at a table she'd been barred from for years. It also carried the gravity of responsibility, public attention, and the kind of scrutiny she had spent years avoiding. She took a breath. There was a pause, long enough for her to think, to put two options against one another: the instinct to protect what little she had left, and the hunger to reclaim a professional life. If you're sincere, she said, quietly, then the offer must carry more than equity. I will accept, but only if we build something that changes the fabric of this company. A 30% wage increase for our cleaning staff to start. A scholarship fund using 5% of management fees from the pilot to sponsor employees' children and training programs. And a clear plan for transition, so the people who have kept this building running don't lose their jobs or their dignity when we reorganize. Her terms were simple and direct. She did not ask for extravagant titles or public ceremonies. She asked for dignity for the people who had been invisible. She asked for mechanisms that reinforced mobility, not only for herself, but for the network that had sustained her through the lean years. Marcos felt a sharp, immediate answer to each condition inside him. The numbers would be budgetary pain. The scholarship fund would reduce short-term margins. But in the calculus of consequence, reputation, employee morale, the moral architecture of his company, it felt necessary. He had been rescued by a person whose life had been pushed sideways by scandal and by circumstance. The least he could do was transform his gratitude into structural action. Agreed, he said. 30% wage increase for cleaning staff is substantial, but we will find the funds.
5% of management fees earmarked for scholarships during the pilot and scaled with the growth of the program. We'll design a training pipeline and guarantee an orderly process for role transitions. He hesitated and then added, with a tone that mixed a business decision and a personal vow, and I want you to be salaried for the role. You won't lose the basics while we build this. Anna let the offer sit with her. Her life had taught her to be suspicious of generosity that did not include procedural clarity. She asked, will this be written into the agreement, not an addendum with vague promises? Written, Marcos said, all of it, in black and white, in the governance structure. You won't be reduced to gratitude. They shook hands. It was not a theatrical handshake. It felt like two people anchoring a shared responsibility. The rest of the evening moved as if in a backward sweep. Contracts were refined, signatures penciled in, lawyers made notes. The investors agreed to the phased 500 million reals, contingent 300 million reals, and a pilot program across 3 cities in Brazil to be executed within 18 months. The governance framework included a steering committee with independent auditors, and the human resources commitments, 30% wage increase for cleaning staff, 5% of management fees to a scholarship fund, were to be codified in the social responsibility appendix. When the press release circulated days later, it spoke of a renewed partnership with Beaumont Capital, of cautious expansion into European markets, of phased funding and governance safeguards. Anna's name appeared in the release as head of pilot operations and strategic integration. Marcos' statement was measured and grateful. The company prepared for a public face they had not expected to wear so quickly. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of jubilation and the sober planning that follows any major commitment. The operations team began mapping pilot sites. HR convened to calculate the logistics of a 30% increase. Finance rerouted budgets. A small project management office was established to track earnout KPIs. Legal filed the documents that would govern the staged disbursements. For Anna, the days that followed were a blur of briefings and interviews and itinerary planning. Her life changed in practical ways. A proper contract, a salary that meant sleep without the immediate arithmetic of bills, a small office with a window that looked out over the Avenida. She accepted the title with a mix of relief and the low-burn unease that comes with re-entering public life. She was practical enough to know that the job would be work, hard, relentless work, and she welcomed it with the kind of discipline that had carried her through hard years. The cleaning staff reacted in varied ways. Some were heartened by the wage increases, which arrived within the first payroll cycle as a careful adjustment. Others were wary of promises with future conditions.
The company mitigated this by immediate upfront payments to current staff, an advance on the first tranche, and by town hall meetings where HR and the new scholarship committee, of which Anna was a founding member, explained processes and eligibility. It was messy, but honest. In the following weeks, the pilot teams began audits, customer calls, and training programs. The company opened recruitment for roles tied to the pilots and prioritized internal candidates for upskilling. Anna spent her time in the field and in strategy rooms, balancing the minutiae of KPIs, retention percentages, on-time delivery rates, local margin thresholds, with the broader architecture of governance and community investment. The $500 million pipeline held its early milestones. The pilot cities reported steady gains in operational metrics. Investors released the second tranche as scheduled, after an independent verification showed that the KPIs were met or exceeded. With each verified success, the board's confidence grew. With each publication of a verified metric, the company felt itself a little less fragile and a little more legitimate in the eyes of the market. Within 6 months, the impacts promised as social commitments became concrete. The 30% wage increase took effect for cleaning staff across all company facilities. The immediate effect on morale was visible. Absenteeism dropped, staff meetings were more engaged, and the formerly invisible staff had a sharper, deserved presence in the life of the company. The scholarship fund, seeded by 5% of management fees from the pilot, launched an application process and awarded its first round of scholarships, supporting children of employees to continue secondary education, fund technical courses, and enroll in preparatory classes for higher education. The scholarship committee, chaired by Anna and including representatives from HR and community leaders, awarded 30 scholarships in its first cycle and set targets to scale the program if the pilot continued to succeed. The pilot's operational success drew interest from new prospects in Europe. Jean-Claude's network opened doors to exploratory conversations in Lyon and Marseille. The discussion of the conditional $300 million turned into concrete proposals for joint projects, logistics centers, a shared R&D lab, and a proposed European office that would be staffed with a mix of local talent and Brazilian managers who had proven themselves in the pilot. The conditional tranche was not automatic. It required the pilots to hit performance metrics, which they did, albeit with the inevitable lessons that come with scaling. Anna's public profile shifted with the companies. She began to accept media requests, not as a celebrity, but as an executive with experience across markets. She appeared on panels that discussed corporate responsibility, labor dignity, and the importance of second chances.
Her story, condensed, respectful, and told with her consent, resonated. Interviewers focused on her expertise as much as on her past. When asked about the scandal that had once cost her so much, she spoke with clarity that emphasized facts. She had been investigated and cleared. She had chosen quiet work to support her son and rebuild. Her tone never leaned into self-pity. It leaned into the practical. At 9 months, the company announced the formalization of the pilot's success and the release of the additional $300 million to execute a European rollout and joint R&D initiatives. The additional capital fueled the opening of an office in Lyon, led operationally by a bicultural team, including Anna and other managers who had risen from within the company's ranks. The budget included expansion of training programs, additional hiring and operations, and a fund for community projects in the neighborhoods where the pilots had run. By the end of the first year, measurable changes were evident. The company had increased headcount by 200 positions across operations and customer service, prioritizing hires from the pilot regions and internal promotions. The scholarship program had expanded to fund a total of 120 scholarships in its first year, focusing on technical courses and higher education preparatory programs. The cleaning staff's average wage had risen by 30%, and the company reported a decrease in staff turnover across operational roles. The steering committee met quarterly and published transparent KPI reports that became reference points for future investments and for other companies watching the experiment. Anna took her role seriously. She traveled to Lyon and Paris multiple times to meet with Jean-Claude and the pilot partners. She negotiated vendor contracts, visited fulfillment centers, and led training workshops in Portuguese for newly hired managers who had to understand the company's cross-cultural expectations. She also maintained a presence in Sao Paulo, where she continued to chair the scholarship committee and oversee the transition processes for staff affected by reorganizations. Her son Gabriel, who had been an anxious presence in her early speeches, began to see the benefits of stability: school fees paid, tutoring secured, and more than anything, a mother whose schedule no longer revolved around the immediate arithmetic of survival. Public recognition followed the tangible outcomes. Anna was invited to speak at a conference on social mobility and corporate responsibility. Journalists came, curious but respectful, and editors quoted her lines about dignity and work, phrases she had honed in the privacy of planning rooms rather than on a podium. She accepted interviews that focused on the operational lessons of the pilot, how clear KPIs, aligned incentives, and governance could make investments safer and more inclusive. Marcos, too, changed in ways that were subtle and lasting.
He learned to defer in meetings, to invite Anna to speak first on operational matters, and to hold board discussions where social impact was a persistent line item rather than a footnote. He instituted a quarterly floor walk where executives spent a morning with frontline staff, cleaners, warehouse workers, client service agents, listening rather than directing. The gesture was practical and symbolic, and it shifted company culture over time. 1 year after the day the French delegation arrived, the company held a modest celebration in the same conference room where the morning's panic had once lived. Investors attended remotely and in person. Jean-Claude made remarks about prudence and the long view. Felipe spoke of partnership and the value of local leadership. Marcos offered thanks not in a speech of grand gestures, but in a series of acknowledgments, names, faces, the recognition of specific contributions. Ana stood after Marcos's remarks to address the room. She spoke with the plain, rooted elegance that had never left her. "This is not my victory," she said. "It is ours. It belongs to the people who sweep the floors at dawn and to the teams who answer customer calls at night. It belongs to those who keep going when the world says doors are closed. And it belongs to leaders who are willing to let their decisions cost them money if it means dignity for others." Her words landed with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen reputations wrecked and rebuilt them with labor and care. There were no rhetorical flourishes, only the quiet force of truth. The room felt for a moment like a community rather than a hierarchy. The investors applauded. Jean-Claude, who had once entered the building with a hesitation that suggested distance, rose to his feet and joined in the applause with an ease that felt like acceptance. The press, some of whom had arrived earlier to cover the official announcement, captured images of Ana and Marcos together at the table. The photographs would circulate with headlines about a rescued deal and an unlikely leader. Stories that, for once, centered not on shock, but on structural change. In the months that followed, the company continued to refine its approaches. The scholarship program hired a small professional team to manage applications and to partner with local educational institutions. The wage increase remained a structural policy. The training pipeline matured into a formal program that provided certifications and clear promotion routes. Other companies took note, and a few reached out to learn how to adapt similar models. The steering committee's transparent reports became a resource not only for investors, but for communities who wanted accountability. Ana's life changed in technical ways, more responsibility, more visibility, and in quieter, deeper measures. Her relationship with Gabriel stabilized. He began to imagine paths that included higher education.
She reconnected, carefully, with colleagues from her past life in France. Some doors, once closed, reopened with new contexts and new humility. She still cleaned occasionally, not out of necessity, but as a personal ritual to stay connected to the people who had sustained her while she reclaimed a professional life. Those moments were never staged. They were part of who she was, and a reminder that dignity does not come only with titles. Marcos found an evolving conscience in business practice, becoming part of the company's standard operating procedure. He understood that the change they had made was not a PR line, but an orientation. He held the company's balance sheet and its moral ledger with a new dual attentiveness. A year later, Ana accepted an invitation to speak at a European conference in Paris. It was one of the moments where the arc of her life, childhood in Sao Paulo neighborhoods, exile into anonymity, return to dignity, felt like the visible shape of a private miracle built on work and persistence. Jean-Claude attended the panel. Felipe arrived with a small delegation. They listened not as patrons, but as partners. Back in Sao Paulo, the company reported healthier retention numbers, an increased pool of managerial applicants from within, and new contracts that flowed not from a spectacle, but from credibility. The $800 million pipeline, consisting of the initial $500 million and the conditional $300 million released after pilot success, had become a realistic pathway rather than an abstract possibility. It required ongoing diligence. It also produced measurable benefits. Ana's transformation was not a tale of overnight rescue. It was the slow, stubborn rebuilding of trust and reputation, anchored by professional competence and a personal insistence on dignity. The scandal from years before remained a fact of her history, but it no longer defined her future. The company that had almost slipped into crisis because of a missing translator had, through an unlikely intervention, restructured not only a deal, but part of its corporate conscience. The last scene closes not on a single triumph, but on a continuing work.
a community meeting in a school auditorium where scholarship recipients spoke about courses they had entered, a staff room where cleaning staff debated curriculum choices for their children, an operations center where teams mapped expansion plans for new cities. Anna, standing at a small podium, listened, answered, and sometimes made a phone call. The city beyond the windows moved with its ordinary, indifferent rhythm. Buses, traffic, the hum of lives that rarely get newsprint glory, but inside the room, things were different. Marcos walked in after the meeting, and they exchanged a look that had between them the quiet currency of shared responsibility. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled, not a grand expression, but a knowing one. "Do the work," she replied. "Keep the promises." He nodded.
He had learned that leadership could be measured as much in making room for others as in speaking for a company's future. Outside, on that Sao Paulo afternoon, the marble and glass of the building caught the light. A cleaning cart sat folded in a corner, no longer an emblem of invisibility, but part of a larger narrative, of people noticed, of obligations honored, and of the slow, steady building of bridges between worlds. The investors had arrived seeking profit and possible access to a new market. They left with an operational partner and a clearer sense that profit and responsibility could align. Anna looked out the window toward the city, thinking of Gabriel and of the long chain of small, stubborn acts that had led her here. She felt tired and alive. The past, fraught and painful, still had edges, but so did the future, clean, commanding, and full of possibility. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that talent lives in unexpected places and that dignity in work should never depend on visibility.